Mom, let's be honest, you can't handle this anymore. We're taking over everything now, the finances, the house, all the decisions.
That's what Claire said to me, standing in my living room on Christmas Eve, her voice dripping with false concern like honey laced with arsenic. My son Daniel stood beside her, nodding like a trained dog, his eyes darting around my home as if calculating what each piece of furniture might fetch at auction. They thought I was weak, confused, a forgetful old woman who'd accidentally left the stove on one too many times. They had no idea that every stumble, every misplaced word, every senior moment I had performed over the past few weeks had been deliberate bait, carefully laid traps waiting for greedy hands to spring them. "We're taking over everything now," Daniel announced, his voice tight with barely concealed excitement. "The finances, the house, all the decisions. You can finally relax." Relax. That word tasted like poison in my ears. I sat in my husband's old armchair, the one I'd kept for 32 years since his death, and simply nodded. Let them think I was surrendering. Let them believe their performance of filial duty was convincing. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that this house had been wired, legally, financially, procedurally, with what my late husband and I used to call the bell device. Touch something you shouldn't? The bell rings. Try to alter a document? The bell rings louder. Attempt to transfer an account without authorization? The bell becomes a siren that echoes through courtrooms. My husband was a meticulous man, paranoid, some might say, but I called it prescient. He'd seen this coming decades ago, long before Daniel married Claire, long before my son's eyes turned hard with entitlement. Together, we'd build an invisible fortress around everything we'd worked for, a network of tripwires and triggers that would snap shut the moment someone tried to steal what wasn't theirs. And now, watching them circle my home like vultures eyeing roadkill, I felt that old familiar sensation, the metallic tremor of the bell preparing to sound. Claire perched on my sofa, crossing her legs with practiced elegance, her designer handbag placed deliberately on my coffee table like a flag claiming conquered territory. "We are already spoken to a few financial advisors," she said, her smile sharp as a scalpel. "They agree you need help, real help." The manipulation was textbook. Isolate the target, undermine their confidence, make them doubt their own competence until they hand over everything willingly. But I wasn't some confused widow drowning in paperwork. I was a woman who'd spent 3 decades managing every cent, every investment, every legal document in this house. I knew exactly what I owned, where it was, and who had the right to touch it. And these two parasites, masquerading as concerned family, had absolutely no claim to any of it. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, and for a moment, just a flickering instant, I saw something in his face that might have been shame. But Claire's hand found his, squeezing it with possessive certainty, and whatever conscience he had left shriveled back into darkness. "We're doing this for you, Mom," he said, his voice hollow. "We love you." Love. They kept using that word as if repetition would make it true. I looked at them both, these strangers wearing my family's faces, and thought about the handwritten addendum my husband had left buried in the trust documents, a single paragraph, easy to miss unless you knew where to look, that transformed any unauthorized tampering into immediate legal violation, a paragraph that turned their greed into self-inflicted evidence. They thought they were stepping into power. I knew they were stepping onto a tripwire. "Of course, sweetheart," I said softly, letting my voice quaver just enough to sound convincing. "Whatever you think is best." Claire's smile widened with triumph. Daniel exhaled with relief. And somewhere in the quiet depths of my house, in the safeguards built into decades-old paperwork and newly updated digital systems, I felt the first delicate vibration of the bell beginning to hum. They had no idea what was coming, but I did. And by God, After everything they were about to try, every document they'd photograph in secret, every account they'd attempt to access, every conversation where they'd pressure and manipulate and treat me like an inconvenient obstacle to their inheritance, by the time that bell finished ringing, they'd understand exactly what it meant to underestimate Margaret Ellison. Let them make their move. Let them reach for what wasn't theirs. The bell was waiting, and so was I.
But I didn't have to wait long. The morning after Christmas, Daniel showed up at my door with coffee and croissants from that overpriced bakery downtown. The kind of gesture that might have seemed sweet if his eyes hadn't been scanning my hallway like a real estate appraiser sizing up square footage. "Thought we could go through some paperwork together, Mom," he said, his voice artificially bright. "Just to get organized." Organized, that's what they were calling it now. I took the coffee, still hot, the cup warming my arthritic hands, and led him to the dining room, the same table where his father and I had signed our original trust documents 30 years ago, the same table where we'd celebrated Daniel's graduation, his wedding, every milestone that once mattered. Now it was just another surface for him to spread his ambition across. He pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in Claire's handwriting. I recognized her looping script immediately. Too perfect, too controlled. Like everything else about her. Lists of accounts, property assessments, insurance policies. They'd done their homework. I'll give them that. "We've been thinking," Daniel began, his fingers drumming nervously against the table's edge, "that it might be easier if we consolidated everything, put it all under one umbrella for simplicity." Simplicity. Another word that meant something entirely different coming from his mouth. "Whose umbrella?" I asked quietly, sipping my coffee. He blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "Well, ours. Mine and Claire's. We'd manage it for you, of course. Make sure everything's handled properly." Properly. As if I'd been handling things improperly for 3 decades. I could smell his cologne, something expensive Claire probably bought him, mixing with the yeasty scent of the croissants neither of us was eating. The morning light coming through the window caught the edge of his legal pad, and I noticed small check marks next to certain items. Already prioritizing. Already deciding what was worth taking first. "Your father and I set things up very carefully," I said, keeping my tone mild, almost drowsy. "There are reasons for the way everything is structured." Daniel nodded too quickly, his knee bouncing under the table. Sure, but things have changed, right? You're getting older. It's a lot to keep track of." There it was again, that gentle condescension wrapped in concern like rot wrapped in silk. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I'd been tracking everything with perfect clarity. Every account balance, every dividend payment, every clause and every document. My mind was sharper than it had been in years, honed by the certainty that this moment was coming.
Over the next few days, they circled tighter. Claire started showing up unannounced, her perfume announcing her presence before she even knocked. She'd bring groceries I didn't need, then linger in my kitchen, opening drawers, commenting on how cluttered things looked, suggesting we streamline my filing system. "You have so much paperwork, Maggie," she said one afternoon, her voice honey-sweet with false sympathy. "All these folders and documents. Don't you find it overwhelming?" She was standing near the hutch where I kept old tax returns and bank statements, the visible layer, the decoy paperwork. The real documents, the ones that mattered, were elsewhere, hidden in plain sight where greedy hands would eventually find them and trigger exactly what my husband and I had designed them to trigger. "Sometimes," I admitted, letting my shoulders sag a little, "I forget where things are." Claire's eyes lit up with what she probably thought was compassion, but looked more like hunger. "That's exactly why we need to help, before things get confused." Confused. They loved that word, as if confusion was my natural state now. But I wasn't confused. I was listening, watching, cataloging every probing question, every subtle pressure, every moment they thought they were manipulating me, when really they were just adding evidence to a file they didn't know existed. Daniel called that evening, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Mom, we found some discrepancies in your accounts, numbers that don't quite add up." My pulse didn't even quicken. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Just irregularities. Nothing major, but it's concerning. We really need full access to everything so we can straighten it out." Full access, the words they'd been building toward all along. I could hear Claire's voice in the background, coaching him, feeding him lines. They'd rehearsed this, probably practiced the conversation multiple times until Daniel could deliver it with just the right mix of concern and authority. "I trust you'll figure it out, sweetheart. You were always good with numbers." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. Daniel had never been good with numbers. He'd barely passed high school math. But he needed to believe I still saw him as competent, capable, trustworthy. He needed to believe I was blind to what they were really doing. That night, I sat in my bedroom with the lights off, listening to the house settle around me. The creaks and sighs of old wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the distinct sound of traffic on the main road. And underneath it all, so faint only I could hear it, the metallic whisper of the bell waiting to ring. They thought they were tightening their grip, closing in on their prize. Every conversation, every visit, every gentle suggestion was another thread in the web they believed they were weaving around me. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't see, was that I'd been weaving my own web for years. And every move they made, every word they spoke, every document they eyed with barely concealed avarice, was pulling them deeper into a trap built from their own greed. The bell hadn't rung yet, not officially, but I could feel its vibration growing stronger, humming through the foundation of my home like an approaching storm. And when it finally rang, when they finally reached for what they had no right to touch, the sound would be deafening.
But first, I had to make sure they'd ring it themselves. That's the thing about traps. They only work if the prey walks into them willingly. And Daniel and Claire were already circling, already sniffing the air, already convinced they were the hunters in this scenario. So I gave them what hunters craved most, the appearance of weakness and opportunity. It started small. A Tuesday morning, I left my reading glasses on the kitchen counter instead of on the dining table where I always kept them. Claire noticed immediately during her uninvited visit, her eyes tracking the small deviation like a predator spotting a limp. "Losing things, Maggie?" she asked, her voice sticky with false warmth. I touched my temples with trembling fingers, a performance I'd perfected over the past few days. "I can't remember where I put anything anymore," I murmured, letting genuine exhaustion creep into my voice. Not because I was confused, but because playing this role was exhausting in its own right. She practically glowed with satisfaction. By Thursday, I'd escalated, left the drawer in my study, the one containing copies of old trust documents, pulled open just 3 inches. Not wide enough to seem deliberate, just enough to look like I'd forgotten to close it after rummaging through for something I couldn't find. The documents inside were carefully selected, real enough to seem authentic, detailed enough to be tantalizing. But not the actual trust, just shadows of it, breadcrumbs leading nowhere except toward more questions they'd need full access to answer. I heard Daniel mention it to Claire that evening when they thought I was upstairs. Their voices carried through the heating vents, something they'd never bothered to learn about this old house. "She's getting worse," Daniel whispered, urgency making his voice crack slightly. "The drawer's been open for 2 days, just sitting there." "Perfect," Claire responded, her tone sharp with satisfaction. "Give it another week. Let her decline a little more. Then we move." Decline. As if I were milk souring in the sun. I stood at the top of the stairs, my hand gripping the banister, and allowed myself one small smile in the darkness. Let them think I was declining. Let them believe their timeline was working. What they didn't know was that I'd already made a phone call that afternoon. Linda Morrow answered on the second ring, her voice still strong despite her 73 years. We'd been friends since our husbands worked together at the bank 40 years ago. She'd retired as a senior financial advisor 5 years back, but her mind was still a steel trap when it came to estate structures and legal protections. "Maggie," she said warmly, "I was wondering when you'd call." "You heard?" I asked, settling into my bedroom chair, the one by the window that overlooked the garden my husband had planted. "Small community, people talk." Linda's voice shifted, becoming precise and focused. "Your daughter-in-law has been asking questions at the bank. Very careful questions, very strategic." My stomach tightened, but not with fear, with anticipation. She doesn't waste time. "Neither should we," Linda said firmly. "I'm coming over tomorrow. We need to review everything and make sure all the safeguards are still active. Has anything changed with the trust structure since Thomas passed?" Thomas. Hearing his name still sent a small ache through my chest, but it was a good ache, a reminder of the partnership we'd built, the protections we designed together during late-night conversations about worst-case scenarios we'd hoped would never come. "Nothing's changed," I assured her. "Everything's exactly as we left it. The handwritten addendum, the automatic triggers, the evidence protocols." "Good." Linda paused, and I heard papers rustling on her end. "Because if they try what I think they're going to try, we need every mechanism ready to snap shut the moment they cross the line."
She arrived the next morning carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better decades and wearing practical shoes that squeaked slightly on my heartwood floors. The sound reminded me of hospital corridors and courtroom hallways, places where serious business happened. We worked through lunch, spreading documents across my dining room table. Linda's reading glasses, worn on a beaded chain around her neck, caught the afternoon light as she examined each page with the scrutiny of a jeweler inspecting diamonds. "Your husband was brilliant," she muttered, running her finger down a column of legalese. "This addendum alone, most people would skip right over it, but it's the keystone of the entire structure." I leaned forward, looking at Thomas's handwriting. Even after all these years, the sight of it made my throat tight. His careful script, each letter deliberate and clear, the paragraph that transformed any unauthorized alteration into immediate legal violation. "He knew," I said quietly. "Even then, he knew this might happen someday." Linda looked up at me, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Men who build empires always know their children might try and claim them prematurely. It's an old, sad story." She tapped the document with one manicured nail. "But you two wrote a different ending." She spent the rest of the afternoon installing additional safeguards I hadn't even known were possible. A discrete digital monitoring system that would sync with the original legal structure, motion sensors on specific drawers, time-stamped photograph capabilities on certain documents. Nothing illegal, Linda assured me as she worked, her laptop open on the table. Everything admissible. Everything justified as reasonable protection of your estate. By the time she left, the house felt different. Not just protected, weaponized. Every corner, every drawer, every document now served a dual purpose. Innocent on the surface, devastating if touched with the wrong intentions. That night, I made sure to leave the trust drawer open again, a little wider this time, and I placed my reading glasses on the arm of the sofa where they'd be obvious, vulnerable, forgotten. I even scattered a few bills across the kitchen counter, paid ones, but arranged to look chaotic, overwhelming, like the paperwork of someone losing their grip on simple tasks. The bait was laid. The trap was set. And somewhere in the walls of my home, in the synchronized network of legal triggers and digital sensors Linda had reinforced, the bell hummed with readiness. All they had to do was reach for what wasn't theirs. All I had to do was wait for their greed to do what greed always does: overreach. The question wasn't if they'd trigger the bell. The question was only how loud it would ring when they finally did. That answer came sooner than I expected, and from a direction that reminded me why Linda Marrow had been my closest friend for 4 decades. She called me 3 days after her first visit, her voice crackling with the kind of energy I remembered from her banking days when she'd saved clients from making catastrophic financial decisions. "Maggie, I need to come back," she said without preamble. "I've been thinking about the handwritten addendum, and there's something we need to add, a fail-safe within the fail-safe." My heart quickened. What did you find? Not on the phone, Linda said sharply. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, and make sure you're alone. The way she emphasized that last word sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the January cold seeping through my windows. She arrived exactly at 9, carrying not just her briefcase this time, but a slim laptop bag and what looked like a small toolbox. Her face was set in that expression I'd seen her wear in board meetings, the one that meant someone was about to learn an expensive lesson. "Coffee first," she announced, settling at my kitchen table. "Then we get to work." I poured us both cups from the pot I'd made earlier, the rich smell filling the kitchen with a comfort that felt almost inappropriate given what we were about to discuss. Linda wrapped her hands around the mug, staring into it like she was reading tea leaves. She finally said, "I pulled some records," she said, her voice low and measured. "Public records, nothing illegal. Your daughter-in-law has been busy. Very busy." My stomach clenched. How busy? "She's consulted with 3 different estate attorneys in the past month." Linda looked up at me, her eyes hard. "All of them specialize in conservatorships and competency challenges." The words hit me like a slap. Competency challenges. They weren't just planning to take over my assets. They were building a legal case to declare me mentally unfit. Jesus, I breathed, the coffee suddenly tasting like ash. Linda reached across the table and gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Which is exactly why we are going to make sure every single safeguard Thomas built is not just active, but enhanced. By the time we're done today, this house will be the smartest structure in Washington state." She wasn't exaggerating. Over the next 4 hours, Linda transformed my home into something between a fortress and a witness. She reviewed the trust documents with forensic precision, her glasses sliding down her nose as she made notes in the margins with a pencil she kept licking, a habit that used to drive her husband crazy. "The addendum Thomas wrote is brilliant," she murmured, running her finger along his handwriting one more time. "But it needs teeth in the digital age. Real teeth." From her laptop bag, she pulled out equipment I didn't even know existed. Tiny motion sensors no bigger than buttons, a discrete camera system that could be activated remotely, software that would create time-stamped, legally admissible documentation of anyone accessing specific areas of my home. "This is all legal?" I asked, watching her attach a sensor to the inside of my study drawer, the one I'd been leaving strategically open. "Perfectly legal," Linda assured me, her voice slightly muffled as she worked. "You have every right to monitor your own property and protect your own documents. What we're installing is essentially a very sophisticated security system with documentation capabilities." She moved through my house like a surgeon, identifying pressure points and vulnerabilities I'd never considered. The filing cabinet in the basement, the safe deposit box key I kept in my jewelry box, even my personal laptop. She installed monitoring software that would track any attempt to access my accounts or change passwords. "They're going to try," Linda said matter-of-factly as she typed commands into her laptop. "Claire strikes me as the type who'll attempt a digital takeover first. Email accounts, banking passwords, everything. This will catch it all." By early afternoon, we sat back at the dining table, surrounded by the evidence of our morning's work. Linda pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before, thick with papers, tabs marking different sections. "Now," she said, her voice taking on the formal tone I remembered from her presentations at the bank, "we need to discuss the nuclear option." I leaned forward. "Nuclear option? A provision I can add to the existing trust structure." Linda opened the folder, revealing dense legal text. "If anyone attempts to alter, forge, or illegally access your documents, if they trigger any of the systems we've installed, this provision automatically activates a complete lockdown, assets frozen, access revoked, and most importantly, an immediate notification goes to your attorney, the bank, and a judge I know who specializes in elder abuse cases." Elder abuse. Hearing it stated so plainly made my hands shake slightly. Linda noticed and covered my trembling fingers with her own steady ones. "I know it's ugly, Maggie, but that's what this is. And we're going to stop it before it goes any further." She spent another hour walking me through the enhanced system, how the sensors worked, what would trigger an alert, who would be notified and when. It was intricate. layered, and absolutely unforgiving to anyone who crossed its boundaries. The beauty of it, Linda explained, closing her laptop with a decisive click, is that they'll do this to themselves. Every action they take will be documented, time-stamped, and logged. They'll build the case against themselves without even knowing it. As she packed up her equipment, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not just protected, but powerful. Like I'd regained ground I didn't even realize I'd been losing. Linda paused at the door, her hand on the knob, winter light from the front window catching the silver in her hair. "Your husband was a smart man, Maggie, but he would be proud of what we've built here today." I felt tears prick my eyes. I can almost feel him here, like he's watching all of this unfold. "Maybe he is," Linda said softly. Then her voice hardened again, snapping back to business. "Call me the moment anything happens. Any attempt to access those documents, any pressure from Dangle or Claire, anything at all. The system will alert me automatically, but I want to hear it from you, too." She left, and the house settled into silence around me. But it wasn't the vulnerable silence of before. It was the silence of something coiled and ready, humming with invisible energy. I walked through each room, seeing it with new eyes. Every drawer, every document, every corner now served a purpose. The Bell device Thomas and I had created years ago had evolved, grown sharper, more sophisticated. And somewhere in that web of legal protections and digital monitoring, I swear I felt my husband's presence, proud, vigilant, ready. The trap wasn't just set anymore, it was armed. And 3 days later, on a gray Thursday afternoon, when I pretended to nap upstairs, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening with Claire's key, the one I'd given her for emergencies. This wasn't an emergency. This was the beginning of their end. I lay perfectly still in my bed upstairs, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady like someone deep in an afternoon nap. But every nerve in my body was alive, listening to the sounds filtering up through the old house. The click of the door closing, too soft, too careful. The whisper of footsteps on hardwood. Claire's expensive shoes, the ones with leather soles that squeaked slightly when she tried to move quietly. And then, silence. The kind of silence that meant someone was standing still, listening, making sure the coast was clear. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my breathing even, in and out. The performance of sleep, the illusion of vulnerability. I heard her move toward my study. The door creaked. I'd never oiled those hinges, and now I was grateful for it. Every sound was intelligence. Every creak was confirmation. Then came the sound I'd been waiting for, the slow slide of the drawer opening, the one containing the trust document copies, the bait I'd laid out so carefully. From my bed, I couldn't see her, but I could picture it perfectly, Claire's manicured hands rifling through papers, her phone out, camera ready. She probably thought she was being so clever, so careful, documenting everything for whatever legal challenge she was building. What she didn't know was that the drawer itself was documenting her. The motion sensor Linda had installed activated the moment the drawer opened past a certain point. A tiny camera no bigger than a shirt button, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, began recording. Time-stamped, date-stamped, legally admissible in any court in the state. I heard pages rustling, the soft click of a phone camera, once, twice, 3 times. Each click was another nail in her coffin, though she didn't know it yet. The door closed with a soft thud, and I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway. The front door opened and closed with that same careful quietness. I waited a full 5 minutes before sitting up, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of knowing the trap had been sprung. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Linda. System activated. Images captured. Call me. I called her immediately, my voice steadier than I expected. She was here. I know, Linda said, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in her tone. I got the alert 10 minutes ago. She photographed 4 pages of the trust documents.
The system captured everything, her face, the time, even the metadata from her phone when she took the pictures. "What now?" I asked, moving to the window and looking out at the empty driveway. "Now we wait," Linda said firmly. "She'll share those photos with Daniel, they'll study them, think they're getting somewhere, and then they'll make their next move. They always do." She was right. The next day, Daniel showed up with a folder under his arm and determination written across his face like a bad poker hand. He settled at my dining table without being invited, spreading papers across the surface with proprietary confidence. "Mom, we need to talk about some discrepancies," he said, his voice tight with rehearsed authority. "I've been reviewing your documents and there are some issues we need to address." I looked at the papers he'd laid out, printouts of the photos Claire had taken, notes in the margins in her handwriting, questions circled in red ink. "Where did you get those?" I asked softly, though I knew exactly where. His jaw tightened. "That's not important. What's important is that these numbers don't make sense. This account here," he tapped a line with his finger, "it shows transfers that aren't documented anywhere else." I leaned forward, squinting at the paper like I was struggling to see it. "I don't understand what you mean, sweetheart." "That's the problem," Daniel said, his voice rising with frustration that sounded almost desperate. "You don't understand. You're not tracking things properly anymore. That's why we need to take over before something goes really wrong." His hands were shaking slightly as he pushed another paper toward me. And on that paper, God, I almost laughed, he had made notes. Handwritten changes, corrections to account numbers, suggestions for reorganizing asset distribution. He had written directly on the document. The same document that, according to Thomas's handwritten addendum, was legally protected from any unauthorized alteration. "Let me just fix these numbers," Daniel muttered, pulling out a pen. "It'll be easier if I just..." He started writing on the copy of the trust document, crossing out numbers, adding new ones, his pen scratching across the paper with quick, aggressive strokes.
And somewhere in the walls of my house, in the digital systems Linda had installed, I knew another alert was being generated, another photograph taken, another piece of evidence documenting my son's attempt to alter protected legal documents without authorization. The second bell had rung. I watched him work, this stranger wearing my son's face, and felt something cold and final settled in my chest. Not quite grief, not quite anger, something in between, the emotional equivalent of a door closing and locking for the last time. "There," Daniel said, leaning back with satisfaction. "That's better, more organized. I'll take this to the bank tomorrow and get everything sorted out." "Will you?" I asked quietly. He looked at me sharply, perhaps hearing something in my tone that made him uneasy. "Of course. That's what you want, right? For everything to be taken care of?" I nodded slowly, letting him believe what he needed to believe. He left with his marked-up documents, his folder full of stolen photographs, his conviction that he was helping rather than stealing. My phone buzzed the moment his car pulled away. "Linda." He altered the documents. "On camera, we have everything." Me. "What's next?" Linda. "They'll try to access the accounts next. That's when we bring down the hammer." I set my phone down and walked to the window, watching the winter afternoon fade into early darkness. The neighborhood was quiet, families inside having dinner, living their normal lives, unaware of the small war being waged in the house on the corner. 3 days later, I got the call I'd been expecting. My bank manager, Robert Chen, his voice carefully neutral. "Mrs. Ellison, we've had an inquiry about your accounts. From your son Daniel. He was asking about transfer procedures and access protocols." My throat tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that any account changes would require your direct authorization and presence," Robert said, his tone warming slightly with what sounded like protectiveness. "But, Mrs. Ellison, I wanted you to know, he also submitted a request for power of attorney documentation, said you'd agreed to it." The third bell. Louder than the others. "I never agreed to that," I said clearly, firmly, making sure Robert heard the steel in my voice. "I know," Robert said quietly. "That's why I'm calling. The documentation he submitted has some irregularities. I think you should speak with your attorney. Soon." After I hung up, I sat very still, feeling the machinery Thomas and I had built decades ago beginning to move. Gears turning, systems activating, the bell resonating through legal channels and protective structures that Daniel and Claire didn't even know existed. They'd touched what they shouldn't touch. They'd altered what they had no right to alter. They tried to access what was never theirs. And now the bell wasn't just ringing, it was screaming. And the beautiful thing, the truly perfect thing, was that only I could hear it. To Daniel and Claire, everything probably seemed to be going exactly according to their plan. They'd accessed my documents, they'd made their notes, they'd started the process of taking control. In their minds, they were winning. They had no idea they were drowning. The phone calls started coming more frequently after that. Daniel would ring in the morning, his voice clipped and businesslike, asking questions about accounts I'd supposedly forgotten, or bills I'd supposedly neglected to pay. "Mom, the electric company says you're 2 months behind," he announced one morning, his tone sharp with accusation. I held the phone away from my ear slightly, letting his voice become background noise while I looked at the paid invoice sitting on my desk. Current through March. Paid online the same day it arrived, like I'd done for the past 15 years. "Are they?" I said vaguely, injecting just enough confusion into my voice. "This is exactly what we've been talking about," Daniel pressed, his frustration bleeding through. "You're not keeping track of things. You're letting important stuff slip. What if they'd shut off your power?" The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost insulting. Create a crisis that didn't exist, then position himself as the savior. "I suppose you're right," I murmured, letting my voice waver. "Maybe you should handle it." I could practically hear his satisfaction crackling through the phone line. "That's what I've been saying. We need full access to everything so we can make sure nothing falls through the cracks." Full access, always circling back to that. After he hung up, I called the electric company myself, spoke to a supervisor named Patricia, who confirmed what I already knew. My account was current, had been for years, showed no late payments or issues whatsoever. "Has anyone else called about this account recently?" I asked, my voice steady and clear, nothing vague about it now. Patricia paused, and I heard computer keys clicking. "Actually, yes. A man claiming to be your son called yesterday asking about payment history and whether we'd accept third-party account management." My jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "That we'd need written authorization from you directly, which we never received. Is everything all right, Mrs. Ellison?" "Everything's fine," I assured her. "But please make a note on my account that I'm the only person authorized to make changes or inquiries." "Already done," Patricia said, and I heard the smile in her voice. "We get calls like that sometimes. Usually doesn't end well for the caller." She had no idea how right she was. Claire showed up that afternoon, unannounced as always, carrying a casserole she'd obviously picked up from the grocery deli and pretended to have made herself. The smell of institutional chicken and industrial spices filled my kitchen as she set it on the counter. "You look tired, Maggie," she said, her eyes scanning my face like a doctor looking for symptoms. "Are you sleeping well?" "Well enough," I replied, moving slowly to the cabinet to get plates I had no intention of using. She followed me, standing too close, her perfume overwhelming in the small space. "Daniel's worried about you. We both are. He told me about the electric bill situation." I turned to face her, letting my shoulders sag, letting my hand shake slightly as I held the plate. "I don't remember not paying it." "Exactly," Claire said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "That's what concerns us. These memory lapses, the confusion. It's getting worse, isn't it?" The gaslighting was textbook. Tell someone they're confused often enough, treat them like they're incompetent often enough, and eventually they start to believe it. But I wasn't buying what she was selling. "Maybe," I whispered, setting the plate down with a clatter that made her step back slightly. She recovered quickly,
moving to the drawer where I kept kitchen towels, and where Linda had installed another motion sensor. Claire pulled out a towel with proprietary familiarity, wiping down my counter like she owned the place. "We've been thinking," she said, casually, too casually, "that it might be time to consider some living arrangements. Somewhere with support, people to help with daily tasks." Living arrangements, support, daily tasks. She meant a facility. She meant stripping away my independence and warehousing me somewhere while they picked my estate clean. "I like my home," I said softly, but with enough firmness that she noticed. Her smile tightened at the edges. "Of course you do, but wanting something and being capable of maintaining it are two different things, Maggie. We have to think about what's realistic." Realistic, another word that meant whatever she wanted it to mean. That evening, Daniel and Claire both showed up, together, united front. They settled in my living room like they were staging an intervention, their faces arranged in expressions of concern that looked rehearsed in a mirror. "Mom, we need to talk seriously," Daniel began, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that made my teeth ache. "About your competency." There it was, the word I'd been waiting for them to say out loud. Claire leaned forward, her hands clasped like a therapist about to deliver bad news. "We've consulted with some professionals, Maggie, medical experts, and they agree that your symptoms are consistent with early cognitive decline." "What symptoms?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd let it be in weeks. They exchanged a look, quick, conspiratorial. Daniel pulled out a folder, flipping it open to reveal a typed list. "Forgetting to pay bills," he read off, his voice matter-of-fact. "Leaving drawers open, misplacing personal items, difficulty tracking financial information, confusion about basic household management." Every item on that list was fabricated or manufactured by them. Every single one. "We're not trying to hurt you," Claire said, her voice oozing false compassion. "We're trying to help before something really bad happens, before you hurt yourself or lose everything you've worked for." The irony was so thick I could taste it. They were the ones trying to take everything I'd worked for, and they'd convinced themselves, or at least convinced Daniel, that they were the heroes of this story. "What do you want?" I asked quietly, though I already knew. Daniel's jaw tightened with something that looked almost like relief. "We want you to sign over power of attorney. Let us handle the finances, the property, the decisions. You can stay here, live your life, and not worry about any of this anymore." "And if I don't?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Claire's expression shifted, hardening almost imperceptibly. "Then we'll have to pursue other options, legal options, a competency hearing, medical evaluation. It's not what we want, Maggie, but we have to protect you, even if that means protecting you from yourself." The threat was clear. Sign over control willingly, or they'd take it by force. I looked at them both, my son and his wife, and saw nothing of the family I'd once known, just two strangers wearing familiar faces, speaking words that sounded like love but tasted like theft. "I need time to think," I said, my voice small and defeated. They smiled. They actually smiled. "Of course," Daniel said, standing up with barely concealed triumph. "But Mom, understand, this is happening, one way or another." They left, and the house fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock Thomas had bought at an estate sale 40 years ago. I sat in that silence for exactly 3 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called Linda. "They just threatened me with a competency hearing," I said, my voice steady as steel. "Good," Linda said, and I could hear papers rustling on her end. Because every word of that conversation was recorded by the system, including the coercion, including the threats, including their admission that they're pursuing this against your will. "What now?" I asked. "Now," Linda said, her voice cold and precise, "now we show them exactly what happens when you corner someone who's been preparing for this fight for 30 years. "How?" Linda paused, and when she spoke again, I heard something almost like joy in her voice. "We ring the bell so loud the whole county hears it." I scheduled the meeting for a Thursday morning at 10, neutral time, the kind of hour when coffee's been finished but lunch hasn't started, when people are alert and focused and less likely to be distracted. I called Daniel myself, using the phone voice I'd perfected over the past weeks. Soft, a little uncertain, defeated. "Sweetheart, you're right," I said, letting the words come out slow and tired. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the power of attorney. Maybe it's time." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then his voice came through, tight with barely restrained excitement. "Really? Mom, that's great. That's the right decision." "Can you and Claire come by Thursday morning?" I asked, adding a small tremor to my voice. "I'd like to have my attorney here too, and someone from the bank, just so everything's official and proper." "Of course," Daniel said quickly, probably afraid I'd change my mind. "Whatever you need, we'll be there." I hung up and immediately called Linda, my voice dropping all pretense. "It's set. Thursday, 10 o'clock. "Your attorney's ready," Linda said crisply. "Robert from the bank will be there, and I've prepared a complete documentation package, every alert, every photograph, every recorded conversation, every unauthorized access attempt. It's 63 pages long." 63 pages of evidence they'd created themselves. Thursday morning arrived cold and bright, winter sunlight streaming through my windows and turning the frost on the grass into diamonds. I dressed carefully, a navy cardigan Thomas had always liked, pearl earrings, practical shoes, the armor of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. My attorney, Richard Morrison, arrived first, 70 years old, retired from a major Seattle firm, still sharp as broken glass. He'd known Thomas, had helped us structure the original trust, understood every mechanism we'd built into it. "Maggie," he said warmly, gripping my hand with both of his, "today's the day." "Today's the day," I echoed, feeling something fierce and clean settle in my chest. Robert Chen from the bank came next, carrying a briefcase and wearing an expression of professional neutrality that didn't quite hide the steel underneath. He'd been my banker for 15 years and knew damn well I'd never missed a payment or forgotten an account. Linda arrived last, dressed like she was heading into a board meeting, her briefcase practically humming with organized fury. We arranged ourselves in my living room, Richard and Robert on the sofa, Linda in the armchair by the window, me and Thomas's old chair, the one I'd sat in that first Christmas Eve when this whole nightmare began. And we waited. Daniel and Claire arrived exactly on time, their faces arranged in expressions of concerned relief. They thought they were walking into a surrender, a signing ceremony, where I'd hand over everything I'd built and protected for decades. They had no idea they were walking into a reckoning. "Mom," Daniel said, moving toward me with arms outstretched like he was greeting a child. I didn't stand, didn't move. Just gestured to the 2 chairs we'd positioned across from us, facing us, like defendants at a trial. Claire noticed the setup first. I saw her eyes flick from person to person, calculating, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite fear, not yet, but weariness. "Thank you for coming," Richard said formally, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of courtroom experience. "Please sit down. We have quite a bit to discuss." They sat slowly, Claire's hand finding Daniel's, squeezing it with what might have looked like comfort, but felt more like a warning. Richard opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. The same folder Linda had prepared, 63 pages thick, tabbed and organized like a prosecutorial brief. "Mr. and Mrs. Ellison, we're here today because Mrs. Margaret Ellison has some concerns about recent activities involving her estate and financial accounts." Daniel's brow furrowed with manufactured confusion. "Concerns? Mom, what's this about? I thought we were here to finalize the power of attorney." "We are here to finalize something," Richard said, and now his voice took on an edge sharp enough to cut, "but not what you expected." He opened the folder, pulled out the first page, a photograph, time-stamped and date-stamped, showing Claire in my study, my drawer open, her phone in her hand aimed at documents she had no right to photograph.
Claire's face drained of color. Daniel looked at the photo, then at Claire, confusion clouding his features. "On January 7th, Richard continued, his voice clinical and devastating, Mrs. Claire Ellison entered this home using a key provided for emergency purposes only.
She accessed private legal documents without authorization and photographed them using her personal device. He laid out another photograph, Daniel this time, sitting at this very table, pen in hand, writing on trust documents. On January 10th, Mr. Daniel Ellison altered protected legal documents in violation of the handwritten addendum established by Mrs. Ellison and her late husband, an addendum that specifically prohibits any unauthorized modification. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Robert leaned forward, his banker's composure cracking just enough to show something cold underneath. On January 12th, Mr. Ellison contacted my institution requesting account access and submitted fraudulent power of attorney documentation. He also fabricated claims about unpaid bills and account mismanagement. "I was trying to help," Daniel said weakly, his voice cracking like thin ice. "You were trying to steal," Linda said flatly, and the bluntness of it hung in the room like a slap. Richard continued, methodical and merciless. "We have audio recordings of coercive conversations, threats of competency hearings, attempts to gaslight Mrs. Ellison into believing she was mentally incompetent, fraudulent claims to utility companies, banks, and medical professionals." He pulled out page after page, evidence stacking up like stones, building a wall that grew higher with each revelation. Time-stamped photos, audio transcripts, bank alerts, motion sensor logs, every unauthorized access, every attempted manipulation, every lie told in the name of helping. Claire found her voice first, and it came out sharp with desperation. "This is entrapment. You set us up." "No," Richard said, his voice cold enough to frost glass. "Mrs. Ellison protected her property using legal security measures. You chose to violate those protections. You chose to access documents you had no right to access. You chose to attempt fraud. Every action documented here was initiated by you." Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Mom," Daniel said, turning to me with eyes that suddenly looked young and lost, "we were just trying to take care of you." "By stealing from me?" I said, my voice steady, clear, carrying none of the weakness I'd performed for weeks. "By trying to have me declared incompetent? By fabricating crises and lying to banks and threatening me in my own home?" My words landed like hammers, and I watched my son flinch with each one. "By treating me like I was already dead and my estate was yours to divide." Silence filled the room, thick, suffocating. Richard closed the folder with a decisive snap. "The trust's automatic protections have been activated. All your access to Mrs. Ellison's accounts has been revoked. All keys and authorizations are hereby canceled, and this documentation has been filed with the county prosecutor's office for review of potential elder abuse charges." Claire shot to her feet, her chair scraping backward. "This is insane. We're family." "Family doesn't steal," I said quietly. "Family doesn't manipulate. Family doesn't threaten." I stood up slowly, feeling Thomas's presence beside me, feeling the weight of 30 years of preparation settling into this single moment. "Once the bell rings," I said, my voice carrying into every corner of the room, "the outcome is already decided." Daniel and Claire stared at me like they were seeing me for the first time, not a confused old woman to be managed and controlled, but someone who'd been 3 steps ahead of them from the very beginning. "You're done here," I said. "Leave my house. Leave my life, and pray that the prosecutor decides not to file charges." They left. No arguments, no protests, just the hollow shuffle of people who'd finally understood the magnitude of their miscalculation. The door closed behind them with a finality that felt like the end of a chapter, or maybe the end of a book. I sat back down in Thomas's chair, my hand steady, my heart quiet. "Is it really over?" I asked the room. Richard smiled grimly. "The legal part is. What happens to them now depends on how thoroughly they want this investigated." Linda moved to sit beside me, taking my hand in hers. "You did it, Maggie. You rang the bell, and they heard it loud and clear." I nodded, feeling something release in my chest. Not triumph, not quite. Something gentler, something like peace finally earned. But as I sat there in the silence they'd left behind, I couldn't help wondering, what would they do now?
What moves would desperate people make when they realized they'd lost everything? As it turned out, nothing. Absolutely nothing. And somehow that silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. They left that Thursday morning and simply disappeared from my life like smoke dissipating in wind. No angry phone calls, no pleading emails, no showing up at my door with tears or threats or final attempts at manipulation. Just absence, where their presence had been. Richard called me 3 days later, his voice carrying a note of professional satisfaction. The prosecutor reviewed the file. They're not pursuing criminal charges, but they've sent a formal warning to both Daniel and Claire. One more attempt to access your assets or contact you without explicit permission, and they'll reconsider. So, it's over, I said, though it felt more like a question than a statement. Legally, yes, Richard confirmed. Emotionally, that's something only you can answer. He was right, of course. The legal machinery had done its work, clicked into place exactly as Thomas and I had designed it to decades ago. But the emotional aftermath, that was territory I had to navigate alone. The house felt different in the days that followed. Lighter, somehow, despite the winter gray that pressed against the windows. The air itself seemed cleaner, like a fever had broken, and I could finally breathe without that constant pressure in my chest. I walked through each room, reclaiming space that had felt invaded, contaminated by their presence and intentions. The study where Claire had photographed my documents, the dining table where Daniel had scribbled his alterations, the living room where they'd threatened me with competency hearings and institutional care. Each space needed to be cleansed, not with sage or ritual, but simply with time, and the steady accumulation of new memories, untainted by their greed. Linda visited on Christmas morning, exactly 1 month after Daniel and Claire had first announced their intentions to take over my life. We sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee that was too strong, and eating cinnamon rolls from the bakery downtown, the good one that had been there for 40 years. "How are you really doing?" Linda asked, her eyes sharp despite the casual tone. I considered the question carefully, rolling it around in my mind like a smooth stone. "I'm grieving," I said finally. "Not for Daniel as he is now, but for who I thought he was, who I wanted him to be." Linda nodded slowly, understanding written in the lines around her eyes. That's the hardest kind of grief. Mourning someone who's still alive. "He chose this," I said, needing to hear the words out loud. "Every step, every decision. I gave him so many chances to stop, to reconsider, to just be my son instead of my predator." "You did," Linda agreed firmly. "You gave him more chances than he deserved. What he chose to do with them was never your responsibility." We sat in companionable silence for a while, the winter sun streaming through the window and warming the worn wood of the kitchen table. This table that had seen so many meals, so many conversations, so much life lived across its surface. "Do you think he understands what he lost?" I asked quietly. Linda was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe someday, when the desperation fades and he's forced to face what he did. Or maybe not. Some people go their whole lives blaming everyone but themselves." "Claire will never understand," I said with certainty. "She'll convince herself I was the villain in this story, that she was trying to help, and I was just a paranoid old woman who couldn't see it." "Probably," Linda said,
taking another bite of cinnamon roll. But her understanding isn't required for your peace. After Linda left, I stood in my living room and looked at the small brass bell Thomas had hung near the fireplace decades ago. A simple decoration, he'd said at the time. But we'd both known it meant more than that. A reminder, a warning, a promise that we'd protect what we built together. I walked over and touched it gently, feeling the cool metal under my fingertips. The last time I'd rung it deliberately was at Thomas's funeral, a single clear note that had echoed through the church and marked the end of one chapter. Now it marked the end of another. I lifted the bell from its hook and rang it once. The sound was pure and bright, filling the room with resonance that seemed to hang in the air long after the physical vibration stopped. "This bell was always meant for them," I whispered, thinking of Daniel and Claire. They just didn't know it until it was too late. But it was also meant for me, a reminder that I had the strength to protect myself, to stand firm, to refuse to be diminished or controlled or treated like an inconvenient obstacle to someone else's ambition. I hung the bell back on its hook and stood there for a moment, feeling Thomas's presence so strongly it almost felt like he was standing beside me. I could almost hear his voice, gruff and warm, telling me he was proud. "We did it," I said aloud to the empty room. "We rang the bell and they heard it. And now they know. Now everyone knows that Margaret Ellison isn't someone to be underestimated." The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs. The refrigerator hummed its steady rhythm. Outside, I could hear children playing in the snow, their laughter bright and uncomplicated. Life continuing, simple and ordinary and mine. I made myself lunch, a real lunch, not the performances I'd been staging for weeks. A sandwich with good bread, tomatoes from the jar I'd canned last summer, sharp cheddar that bit back. I ate slowly, tasting every bite, feeling nourishment sink into my bones. That evening, as the winter sun set early and painted my windows orange and gold, I sat in Thomas's chair and allowed myself to feel everything I'd been holding back. The grief, the relief, the anger, the sadness, the fierce, burning pride. I had protected what was mine, not through violence or cruelty, but through preparation, patience, and the systems Thomas and I had built together when we still believed family meant something sacred. The bell device had worked exactly as designed. Every mechanism had triggered precisely when it should. Every safeguard had held. Every piece of evidence had accumulated like snow on a storm until the weight of it became undeniable. They'd rung the bell for themselves again and again, never realizing that each ring was sealing their fate. And now, in the quiet aftermath, I could finally rest. Not because the pain was gone, pain like this never fully disappears, but because I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that I had done everything I could, everything I should. I had protected my dignity, my home, my legacy. I had refused to be diminished. And in doing so, I had honored not just Thomas's memory, but my own worth. The house was silent again, but it was a different silence than before. Not the silence of vulnerability or fear or waiting for the next attack. The silence of peace, of safety, of a battle fought and won. I closed my eyes and listened to that silence, feeling it wrap around me like a blanket, and somewhere in the depths of it, barely audible but unmistakably present, I could still hear the echo of the bell they had rung for themselves. A reminder that some sounds, once heard, never truly fade. They would carry that echo with them for the rest of their lives, whether they acknowledged it or not.
and I would carry the peace of knowing I had been strong enough to protect what mattered most: myself.